She told me I shouldn't be feeling this. I told her that's exactly why she can't stop. It started with small observations, the kind you don't even realize are shaping your day. Every morning, she would step onto her balcony just as the sun spilled over the rooftops, her hair catching the light in a halo of warm copper tones. She moved with a quiet grace, nothing flashy, nothing exaggerated, but something in the way she tilted her head while reading the morning paper, or the way she folded her arms when she was thinking, made the world feel a little softer, slower, almost alive in a different way. I first noticed her because of her presence. She was in her early 40s, confident yet serene, carrying herself with a calm authority that seemed to belong only to people who had weathered storms and survived. The kind of quiet power that wasn't demanding attention but effortlessly drew it anyway. I caught myself imagining the subtle stories her eyes could tell, of heartbreak, resilience, laughter, and lonely nights filled with thoughts she never spoke aloud. Our worlds collided in the smallest of ways. Sometimes it was as simple as reaching for the same package at the mailroom, our hands brushing for a fleeting second. That touch lingered, not in an obvious way, but in the way it left a quiet echo in my chest. I noticed the warmth of her fingers, the slight hesitation before she withdrew her hand, almost as if she, too, felt something unspoken stirring between us. I walked past her garden once, watching her tend to her plants. The faint scent of lavender and freshly turned soil wrapped around me, a comforting kind of domesticity that somehow felt intimate. Her laugh, light and unguarded, carried across the small courtyard, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to matter. I felt like a witness to something private, something fragile and precious. There was an internal tension that grew with each encounter. I wanted to know her, to speak to her, to understand the hidden layers beneath that calm exterior. But there was also the nagging voice of doubt, the social expectations, the age difference, the invisible line drawn by circumstance. I had no right to intrude on her life, yet every instinct in me was drawn to her like a quiet gravitational pull. By the end of that first week, I realized I was waiting for moments, small, ordinary moments, just to see her. To hear the sound of her voice, the rhythm of her laughter, the gentle sway of her hair in the morning light. I didn't yet know what it meant, this quiet curiosity that wrapped around me like a second skin, but I knew one thing, I couldn't stop noticing her, and somehow, I didn't want to. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that usually drifts by unnoticed, until it didn't. I was coming back from the corner store, juggling a small bag of groceries, when I noticed her struggling on the steps. A box had slipped from her hands, and she was crouched down, carefully picking up the scattered items. Without thinking, I stepped forward. "Here, let me help you with that." She glanced up, startled at first, and then a small, almost reluctant smile appeared. "I shouldn't be bothering you," she murmured, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. I handed her the box, our fingers brushing in the exchange, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to that fleeting contact. Her hand was warm, soft, and steady, and I felt a strange awareness of the way her fingertips lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. As we stood, gathering the remaining items, she laughed lightly, a sound that felt like sunlight spilling over a quiet morning. "I'm hopeless sometimes," she said, shaking her head. I smiled, genuinely amused, and said, "You're not hopeless. You just have a lot on your hands." She tilted her head, her eyes searching mine for some hidden meaning, and I felt a flicker of connection, brief but electric. There was something disarming about the way she moved. She was self-assured, yet in that moment, just for a second, she seemed vulnerable, human, not perfect, not untouchable. I noticed the subtle way her shoulders tensed, the slight hesitation in her voice when she said, "I shouldn't be doing this," almost as if admitting her need for help felt dangerous. I laughed softly, careful not to overstep. "That's why you can't stop," I said quietly, half teasing, half observing. Her cheeks warmed, and she shook her head, a mixture of embarrassment and amusement flickering across her features. It wasn't bold or flirtatious in the obvious sense, but it carried an unspoken acknowledgement, that we were both aware of the tension, the curiosity, the subtle pull. As we finished, she lingered just a little longer than necessary, adjusting the groceries and making small talk about the weather, the neighborhood, mundane things that suddenly felt intimate. Her gaze met mine one more time before she smiled and turned back to her door. I walked away feeling the echo of her presence, her warmth lingering on my skin like a whisper. I realized then that it wasn't just about helping her with groceries. It was about noticing her, seeing her, feeling the quiet electricity of a connection neither of us had yet dared to name. And deep down, I knew that this was only the beginning, the first step towards something that neither of us could stop thinking about. The rain began as a soft patter, gentle at first, then growing into a steady rhythm that drummed against the rooftops. I had just left my apartment when I noticed her standing under the small awning outside her door, a delicate umbrella clutched loosely in one hand. The other hand shielded her hair from the rain, but she didn't seem to mind the droplets that fell onto her shoulders. Without thinking, I hurried over. "Mind if I share the cover?" I asked, holding my umbrella over us. She hesitated, then nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You're going to get soaked," she said softly. But she stepped closer, close enough that our shoulders brushed. I felt the warmth of her against me, the subtle weight of proximity that made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. We walked together in silence for a few steps, letting the rain form a soft cocoon around us. The smell of wet pavement and blooming jasmine from her garden mingled with the faint scent of her perfume, a delicate vanilla undertone that wrapped around me like a quiet promise. I noticed her hand tremble slightly as she adjusted her grip on the umbrella, and without thinking, I brushed her fingers with mine, letting her hold my hand briefly. She sighed, almost audibly, and the sound was so intimate it made my heart skip. "I haven't talked to anyone like this in a long time," she admitted, her voice low, almost a confession. The words hung in the air, vulnerable and raw. I felt an ache in my chest at the hint of loneliness behind her strength, the unspoken history in her eyes. I let my own walls drop just a little. "You're not alone," I said softly, keeping my gaze steady. "It's okay to let someone in." She looked up at me then, eyes glimmering with a mixture of relief and hesitation, as if she were testing the waters of trust for the first time in years. We stopped under a larger awning near the entrance to her building, and the rain poured around us like a curtain, isolating us from the rest of the world. Her shoulder brushed against mine, and I felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat through the thin fabric of her jacket. "I shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, almost to herself, the confession slipping out despite her attempt to contain it. I smiled gently, letting my fingers graze hers again. "Maybe that's exactly why you need it," I said, careful, respectful, but firm. She blinked, a soft shiver passing through her at the words, and for a moment, time slowed. In that shared vulnerability, the walls between us softened, leaving room for connection, warmth, and the first real hint that this quiet curiosity had begun to grow into something neither of us could ignore. The rain, the scent of jasmine, the closeness of her presence, it all wove together into a moment that neither of us would forget. It was late afternoon when she called me over, her voice carrying a warmth that made my chest tighten. Something small had gone wrong in her apartment, a light fixture that refused to turn on, a stubborn bookshelf that needed adjusting. Nothing serious, yet the request felt deliberate, a way to create a reason for us to be near each other. I arrived, hands slightly damp from my hurried walk, and found her waiting, casual yet composed, as if she had anticipated my presence. The moment I stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. Her living room smelled faintly of lemon polish and lavender, a clean, comforting scent that seemed to wrap around me. The sunlight slanted through the window, illuminating the gentle lines of her face and the soft curves of her hair. She smiled at me, that quiet, self-contained smile that carried both invitation and restraint. As I worked on the fixture, our movements intertwined in subtle ways. Her hand brushed mine accidentally, or so it seemed, when she handed me a tool. I felt the warmth of her skin, the small, electric thrill of contact, and the brush lingered just a moment longer than necessary. She laughed softly at her own clumsiness, and the sound seemed to reverberate in the quiet room, filling the space between us. "I shouldn't be doing this," she murmured, almost a whisper, her eyes flicking down for just a second. There was hesitation there, a mix of longing and self-restraint that made the air between us taut with unspoken tension. I looked at her steadily, my own pulse quickening, and said softly, "That's why you can't stop." The words hung between us, quiet but heavy, and I saw her exhale in that small, almost imperceptible way that told me she had been caught off guard, and yet secretly relieved. We paused, both aware of the unspoken electricity. Her fingers brushed mine again as she leaned slightly to steady the bookshelf, and this time neither of us pulled away. I could feel her warmth, the subtle rise and fall of her breathing, and the faint scent of her perfume that lingered in the air. It was a moment charged with desire and hesitation, intimate but entirely innocent, yet the tension was undeniable. We exchanged small glances, smiles that said more than words could capture. Every movement, every accidental touch, seemed amplified, each silence filled with what neither of us dared to voice. The connection was palpable, and for the first time, I realized that the attraction between us wasn't fleeting, it was real, and it was building, a slow, irresistible current that neither of us could resist. By the time I left, the room seemed to hum with the memory of our proximity. I walked away with a heightened awareness of her, of the subtle pull between us, and the knowledge that this was no longer a casual curiosity, it had become something far more profound. It was one of those late evenings when the world feels softened, edges blurred by the dim glow of streetlights and the quiet hum of distant traffic. I had joined her on the balcony, the same spot where I had first noticed her from afar, and now we were sitting together, shoulders brushing, the warmth of our proximity slowly seeping into my chest. The city lights shimmered below us, reflected in her eyes, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, letting the silence stretch comfortably between us. "I haven't felt like this in a long time," she said finally, her voice low, almost hesitant, carrying the weight of years spent holding back. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, glancing at the skyline but not quite meeting my eyes. The words hung in the air, tender and vulnerable, and I felt a quiet ache at the honesty she offered. I turned slightly toward her, careful not to break the fragile intimacy of the moment. "Like what?" I asked softly, inviting her to continue, giving her the space to reveal what she had been keeping hidden. She exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath, and finally let her gaze meet mine. There was a flicker of apprehension in her eyes, but also a glimmer of something else, trust. "Alive," she admitted, almost in a whisper. "Seen. I've spent so long feeling invisible, like no one really notices me." And now, her hand brushed against mine lightly, deliberate, lingering, and I felt the warmth spread through me like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Now it feels like someone does." I didn't move my hand away. Instead, I let our fingers graze, tracing the faint lines and warmth of her skin. "I see you," I said simply, my voice steady, even as my own heart raced. "I notice the little things, the way your eyes crinkle when you smile, the way your hair catches the light, the quiet strength you carry even when you're tired." A small, almost shy smile appeared on her lips, and she leaned slightly closer, the subtle weight of her shoulder pressing against mine. It was intimate but not bold, delicate but charged, a silent confession that neither words nor touches could fully capture. Her eyes held mine, searching, questioning, hoping for reassurance, and I gave it through the steady pressure of my hand and the calm steadiness of my gaze. "I shouldn't be doing this," she murmured again, almost as if confessing a secret sin. I smiled softly, letting my thumb brush her knuckles. "Maybe that's exactly why you need it," I said, gentle but certain. Her breath hitched just slightly, and I knew she felt the truth in those words. For the first time, it wasn't just curiosity or tension between us. It was connection, fragile yet undeniable, a bridge forming over the quiet loneliness we both carried, and a promise that this slow, careful intimacy was just beginning. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind where the sun filtered gently through the curtains, casting soft golden patterns across her living room floor. She had invited me over to help with a small project, organizing a stack of books she had been meaning to sort for weeks. But the task itself was secondary. It was the space between us, the subtle currents of closeness, that made the day feel charged with anticipation. We moved around each other with a natural rhythm, brushing past one another as we reached for the same book, our fingers touching briefly, a spark passing through that neither of us could ignore. Every accidental contact carried meaning, a gentle forearm graze, a shoulder brushing against mine, the warmth of her body so close that I could feel it even without looking. It was intimate without words, a dance of subtle tension and growing familiarity. She laughed at a joke I made about a particularly old, dusty novel, the sound filling the room with a lightness that contrasted the quiet gravity of our shared moments over the past weeks. I felt drawn to her in ways I hadn't anticipated, not just physically, though the warmth of her presence was undeniable, but emotionally, irresistibly. There was a trust between us now, fragile but growing, like a plant reaching for sunlight. As we worked, she leaned slightly closer to reach a shelf, and our hands brushed again, this time lingering for a moment longer. I let my fingers rest gently on hers, feeling the quiet steadiness of her pulse, the warmth of her skin. She didn't pull away, and neither did I. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement that we were both aware of the attraction building between us, and that we were both willing to explore it carefully. At one point, we paused, sitting on the floor amid stacks of books, laughing softly at the chaos we'd created. I brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, tucking it gently behind her ear, and felt the subtle shift of her body toward mine, a wordless invitation. The warmth of her shoulder against mine, the touch of her hand on the floor close to mine, and the soft sound of her breathing created a moment that felt suspended in time. We didn't speak of desire explicitly. There was no need. The small gestures, the laughter, the closeness, they said everything. She smiled at me, eyes reflecting a mix of amusement and trust, and I realized that this was no longer just a curiosity or tension. It was something deeper, something mutual, a harmony of emotion and touch that had been building slowly, carefully, until it felt almost inevitable. By the end of the afternoon, we sat side by side, shoulders touching, hands occasionally brushing, and I knew that the bridge we had been constructing, of trust, affection, and subtle desire, had grown strong enough to carry us into the next stage of our connection. The warmth between us was palpable, but gentle, steady, and entirely ours. The evening had a softness to it, the kind that makes the world feel intimate and small. The sun had set hours ago, leaving a gentle glow from the city lights outside her window. We sat side by side on the balcony, shoulders brushing lightly, wrapped in a shared blanket that smelled faintly of her perfume and the evening air. There was no rush, no expectation, only the quiet presence of each other, the steady rhythm of our breathing, and the subtle warmth of proximity. She lifted her cup of tea, and I noticed the way her fingers curved around it, delicate and deliberate. I reached out to steady it as she shifted, and our hands met in the space between us. The touch was soft, almost casual, yet it carried the weight of everything that had passed between us, curiosity, tension, vulnerability, and trust. Her palm rested briefly over mine, warm and steady, and I felt the quiet power of connection that words could never fully capture. "I'm glad you're here," she murmured, her voice low and sincere. There was no teasing, no playfulness, only honesty and a kind of quiet awe. I turned slightly, so our shoulders were pressed together more fully, letting my hand brush hers once again. "So am I," I replied. "More than I can say." She laughed softly, a sound that carried relief and recognition, and for a moment, we simply watched the city lights flicker below us, letting the silence speak. Her head tilted slightly, brushing against my shoulder, and I felt the subtle warmth of her hair, the faint scent of jasmine and vanilla drifting across me. I didn't move away. Instead, I let her settle there, feeling the rhythm of her heartbeat, the calm steadiness of her presence. A gentle sigh escaped her lips. I wasn't sure if we, her words faltered, hesitant, vulnerable. I turned to her fully, cupping her cheek with one hand. "It doesn't have to be anything complicated," I said softly. "It just has to be real. That's enough." Her eyes glistened in the soft light, reflecting both emotion and trust. She leaned into my touch, and I leaned closer, resting my forehead lightly against hers. It was intimate, warm, and entirely unspoken. A gentle kiss on her cheek followed, tender and affirming, and she smiled, a quiet, radiant smile that said more than words ever could. We stayed like that for a long while, hands intertwined, shoulders touching, breathing together in a harmony that felt both new and familiar. The attraction, the curiosity, the tension, it had all evolved into a connection that was tender, deep, and undeniably ours. By the time we finally moved inside, there was no doubt in either of our minds, this was a beginning, a slow, careful journey of affection, trust, and love, fully embraced and fully felt, the kind of warmth that lingers long after the moment passes. Did you feel the tension, the longing, the quiet moments that made their connection so real? If you enjoyed this slow burn romance, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know which part of their journey touched you the most. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that makes your heart skip a beat.